Hi, I'd like to introduce the next panel. My name is Dan Hamilton, and I serve in the South Carolina State House here from District 20, which is Taylor's, Greer, and some of the east side of Greenville. I appreciate you all being here with us today. It's been a very stimulating conversation for me as someone who is getting ready to go back to Columbia in January and work on many of these same issues, and I look forward to working hand in hand with leaders here at the Palmetto Policy Forum. I serve on the Judiciary Committee, and I'm also chairman of the Upstate Caucus, seeking to unite the 10 upstate counties in South Carolina in the State House. And it's a pleasure to talk to you today and introduce the next panel. For some, federalism kind of brings back the good old days of 1787, men in knickers and powdered wigs. But we're gonna bring it back to fast forward to 2014 and talk about how it applies to where we are right now when it comes to government. Someone wise once said that all of us need to be reminded that the federal government didn't create the states created the federal government. And that wise person was President Ronald Reagan. He said that in his first inaugural address in 1981. And that is something that over and over again I see at the state level. Things that we try to do and we accomplish are oftentimes just trampled on by our federal government. But the states created the federal government, and it's our job to remain sovereign and to show the federal government how we can do things. So it's my pleasure to bring on Maher from the Liberty Foundation in Ohio, and Dr. Orrin Smith, who we all know well, who's a senior fellow at the forum. So gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings from Ohio. All right then. So I started off my morning at 4 a.m. in a snowstorm and then had rain on the drive up from Columbia. So I'm hoping the sun's starting to peek out a bit and I get a tad bit of South Carolina warmth before I have to go back tomorrow morning to cold, dreary, gloomy Ohio. So bear with me if you could. So federalism, advancing liberty in the states. Thank you, Ellen and Orrin, for doing this. It's always great to be down here. This is my second time with you folks on the issue of federalism, so I guess it didn't go too badly the first time. You guys, come on. But bump.
That's your third.
Yvette, at least you need to clap or something. Come on. All right. So let's talk for a minute. The problem that we're seeing in the states is there is a massive dependence on Washington. Orrin will talk about this in terms of numbers, so I won't get into that. But we have seen too many governors and state legislatures put their hands out, not up. And for far too long, that has been going on when, for most of American history, governors and states put their hands up and said, stay out of my jurisdiction. You worry about things there in Washington and mostly national defense. I'll worry about the folks in South Carolina or Ohio or Oklahoma, wherever we might be. And we've seen that increasingly on issues like Medicaid expansion. I know you've had that debate here in South Carolina. It was going all over the country. And that really is a take your free money. Here, more money from Washington, which is really deficit spending on the backs of our kids and grandkids. And they wanted you to get more dependent upon the federal government as you move forward as a state. And more of your state budget become locked with federal funds and requirements and mandates, so that you're starting to debate over a decreasing share of your state budget that really is becoming less and less every year across the country. Education policy is the same thing. We're seeing, again, the federalization of education, of energy policy. And that's just not the way our system was designed to be. But I have some good news. There is good news. Happened last week. We had a bunch of governors win, get reelected, that are going to instill some vibrancy into the laboratories of competition, that great race that is called federalism in America. You know it's good when Froma Harroup, anybody know who she is? She's a lefty columnist out of Hartford, Connecticut, and she soundly wrote a column after the election saying, our fate, my friends on the left, is in federalism in the states. We can't expect anything to happen in Washington because those nasty conservatives are taking control. But boy, we still have Moonbeam Brown out there in California, and we have Andrew Cuomo in New York, and we've got our New England folks, except for Paul LePage up there in Maine, right? And so she's trying to say we need to use the states as laboratories of competition. So that is a great affirmation that federalism truly is a bipartisan idea from way back when all the way till today. But let's talk about some of that good news. You know, you had Scott Walker, one of the most ambitious governors, took on public sector labor unions with Act 10, ran for governor 3 times in 4 years. And what's remarkable is he won by the same percentage he won 4 years earlier against the onslaught of the left. That's a huge triumph in a progressive blue state for a conservative like Scott Walker to have won. You had Rick Snyder in Michigan, who took on private sector unions with right to work in 2012. Again, another target, another focal point of the left, and he survived the election. You had Sam Brownback out in Kansas, who went to phase out the income tax, and the doom and gloom was he was going down. See what happens when you cut taxes. The world comes crashing down, and Sam Brownback was going to be Exhibit A. Unfortunately, Kansas voters didn't agree and put him back in office. So we have yet another example. Oklahoma, Mayor Fallon got reelected after essentially pushing pensions and doing the most aggressive pension reform we've seen in the country, moving state workers into a defined contribution plan outside a defined benefit plan. Rick Scott down in Florida has done a whole lot of different stuff. He was able to beat Charlie Crist. I think that actually became an election of who the voters hated the least. And in that case, Governor Scott prevailed. Yay. So that was good. North Carolina, Pat McCrory was not up for re-election, but he has been very bold in what he's done there, and they expected there to be an onslaught against his agenda. If you remember, you know, you may have gotten some of the ads because you're sort of close to the border, but there was an onslaught that Kay Hagan tried to localize the election, make it all about Pat McCrory and what they'd done in North Carolina, and yet that went falling to the wayside. On the other side of the fence, we've had advances. Voters in Maryland, Massachusetts, and Illinois kicked out their blue governors who kept raising taxes to say we can't take it anymore. We're getting less competitive with those other states that are reducing their tax burden as you increase it. They're reducing their dependency on Washington as you increase it. So there's an opportunity now to do even more in even really blue states where conservative ideas don't tend to soar, they tend to die. So that's good news too. And you know, the only loss on the right in the governor's mansion was the governor in Pennsylvania, who was probably the most timid governor there was. Didn't do much of anything, accepted Medicaid expansion, really was acted like a blue governor. And I think voters there said, well, if you're gonna act blue, we'll just put a blue one in there. So they did. So I think what this means is that we are gonna have a more robust series of governors and state legislatures do more innovative stuff, because what they learned in this last election, forget about the Republican-Democrat component, what they learned is you can be innovative, you can be bold, you can take on the big special interest and still win. And that means the pressure will be on governors who have been doing the opposite. As states lower their tax burden, as they lower their costs because they've taken on public sector unions, as they shift away from dependency on Washington, as they leverage their energy resources for the governors who aren't leveraging their energy resources, they're going to see a boom in jobs. So we're seeing more and more competition, and likely we'll see a huge amount of increased competition among the states over the next 4 years. And remember, if there ever was a case where all boats rise where our governors and states compete on policy, define what works and what doesn't, so that we can all figure out the right way to go. When Washington does it for 310 million people and they're wrong, Obamacare, what ends up happening is 310 million people are impacted in a very profound and negative way. When they try to nationalize education, when they try to nationalize healthcare, when they try to nationalize transportation, one size fits all has rarely ever worked in American history. And so what we need to make sure we do is, as we are citizens in our states, whether we're from in South Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, it doesn't matter. We need to make sure that we say to our state legislators, to our governors, be bold, go big. Or you can be like Tom Corbett in Pennsylvania and we'll send you home. Because I think the message is status quo, standing pat, doing the easy thing will not lead you to the promised land. States are going to leave you behind in South Carolina if you don't advance aggressively and innovate and be bold and go big. You know, The way federalism works best is if we can unring a bell that heretofore has not been unrung. And that is this growth of DC. Even President Reagan, God rest his soul, failed to restrain and shrink the beast. Slowed the growth of it, but couldn't shrink it. And what we've got to figure out as entitlements in the national debt squeeze more and more of our tax revenue, pushing more and more of our discretionary spending into deficit spending, debt spending, thereby increasing the interest on the debt, the math gets really difficult. So it's going to be very important at some point for us to get the power, but equally important in the money out of Washington. And I know there are lots of fans who are block grant folks. I'm not a block grant guy. It's our money, should never leave. If Governor Haley had control of the federal funds that went for education, transportation, health care that we all send to Washington, then they take a huge slice, anywhere between 15 to 30% of every dollar we send gets lopped off and stays in the Beltway, which is why 7 of the 10 highest, richest zip codes are around the Beltway. That's why if you go there, there are cranes everywhere, building, 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 because all the lawyers and lobbyists that have built up around that city. We got to get the money out, because I have every reason to believe that if the legislature and the governor had more control over those funds, they could do more with less and put more money back in your pocket, have a more robust economy, and get Washington focused on the very limited things it should be focused on, which is making sure ISIS doesn't spawn and come to our country and make 9/11 look like kids play. That they figure out what they're going to do when we get a virus that comes across like Ebola, which thankfully isn't that communicable compared to some of the other viruses that, if they do come over, we could see some serious pandemic elements. So we've got to get Washington back in the box, and you have to do that by tying the money and the power together and keeping it in the states, as our founding fathers wisely created, in which the Supreme Court in 1935 and forward started to ignore. So with that, I'll let Orrin go into some of the numbers behind this and some of the other things that he's been working on